This is the
Five Starr
Podcast.
Let me talk to you. This is such good shit. What do you guys want to talk about?
Yeah, I think we're coasting for the show this week. I'm just flying by the seat of my pants right now. It's one of those shows where you got a lot on your mind. You're trying to dish out the content and keep everything consistent, but you look at your format for the week and you say, don't really have a lot of time to pre-plan for this one, so we're just going to dive right in, because I went into this one just not mentally preparing myself, and it was kind of reflective of how the AEW show went. Just going into it and throwing up the hands and saying, whatever. That was sort of my collective thought after Dynamite was over this week. I said, whatever. On to the next one. So, like I said, didn't really have a whole lot of time to pre-plan anything for this show this week. I usually kind of jot down some relative notes to get things going and kind of break the ice a little bit instead of just diving in and talking about the shows. However, I'm just going to try to get through this one and see if I can make it to the other side alive. We do have the regular Friday show for this week. We got the Dynamite Report and the two classic reviews. And I did have my notes open in front of me a second ago, and now I pulled it back up again because I had the wrong document open. Oh yeah, we are doing very well with the show this week. Well, I guess I could throw this out there in the open too. If you are watching the FSWR podcast for the first time, make sure you subscribe, comment, like the show, do all that good stuff. You can also find us on Rumble. We are here every Monday and Friday. And maybe that format will change up relatively soon with the way these shows have been going. Not that the Monday or Friday dates would change, but just the content that you would see on the podcasts. Dive into that just a little bit more when we get into the Dynamite review. But I guess we should talk about the Dynamite Go Home show, right? Jesus Christ, I just realized this is a Go Home show. For that matter, I just realized there's a pay-per-view this Sunday. Or is it Saturday? I think it's Sunday. Maybe I should ask the Jiffy Lube attendant, John Moxley. He always seems to be on top of the dates for pay-per-views. Well, truth be told, the only reason I forgot about it was the fact that I didn't even bother carving out a portion of the show today for a preview rundown. I just figured most of the breakdown of the card wouldn't consist of me saying, fuck that match, or that match looks like it's going to suck. So I really didn't even see much of a point. I mean, maybe I'll do a quick little sneak preview of everything and see what horrors await me over the weekend. I mean, before this show, I don't think I even knew more than 2 or 3 matches that were actually happening. Then I spot checked the wiki page momentarily and saw there were like 5 other matches they announced between last week and this week. Most of them are like, how in the hell did that match get booked? Well, for a go-home show edition, this was not much in the way of building effective hype for the pay-per-view over the weekend. Take, for example, the way they opened the show. The opener for the week. AKA what is supposed to be their way of hooking in viewers without tuning them out from the very start. The match is the company mascot wrestling Kyle Fletcher And for those asking, who in the bluest of blue fucks is Kyle Fletcher? The answer is some guy from Japan that apparently Tony Khan thinks is more important than the actual ratings may reflect after seeing him show up. I believe he was one of several other guys in that faction that Will Ospreay was hanging out with at one point last year. Key point, at one point last year. A group that we have not seen or heard from since last summer. So, figuring Tony just presumes that 99% of the AEW audience already watches New Japan, he just threw the guy out there cold and expected people to A, care, and B, know who the fucking guy was, period. And in exercising my Orange Cassidy boycott card, now you pretty much knew what you were getting from me. I mean, I tuned the match out before Fletcher's music even hit. As soon as I hear that fucking piano melody kick in for that Jefferson Starship tune, whatever it's called, I always forget. Never listened to the band growing up, don't know, don't really care. But, you know, the fact that it's tied with Orange Cassidy gives me all the motivation to tune it out entirely. So that whole charade took up the first 20 minutes of the program. 20 fucking minutes for Orange Cassidy versus Kyle Fletcher in the curtain jerker to their go-home show to the pay-per-view. And these people wonder why they're barely cracking 800,000 viewers most weeks. Fucking retards. So then immediately following that, more stupidity. Ricky Starks did a promo in the back with Renee Paquette, saying that he's sick and tired of getting jumped by Juice Robinson and Jay White. So, of course, he proceeds to then immediately get jumped by Juice Robinson and Jay White. Can't make this shit up, folks. You really can't. Genius Booker is our Lord and Savior Tony Khan. A mastermind of gold he dropped in front of our eyes right here. God, you almost need to write that one down. It was so brilliant. Oh yeah, and before I forget, remember when I was suggesting that the DQ finish to last week's match with Jay White and Ricky Starks was more than likely going to lead to some kind of anything goes street fight match at the pay-per-view with both guys? Not necessarily a match that I wanted to see, but something that you could at least conceivably envision happening. Well, apparently Tony thought it would be a better idea to shoehorn Ricky and Jay into a battle royal with 18 other guys instead. Because he's a genius. So moving on, also skipping past a Jungle Boy pre-tape that probably did a good job lulling most of the audience into a coma, here come FTR, the AEW World Tag Team Champions, for those that may have forgot. Someone brought up a valid point recently, and I never put much thought into it. Have FTR defended the belts one time since they won them from the Guns? Trying to think. I don't recall a single title defense they've had since winning the straps. Unless it happened on Dark. Huh. Or could just be part of Tony's intellectual game plan that's just so above my ability to comprehend. Well, in any case, the champs were out for a promo, and by that, I mostly mean that Dax was out there to cut a promo and Cash was the unfortunate guy holding a microphone and saying some words. And I like Cash, not trying to give him a hard time or anything, but this is all Dax carrying the mic drop material, saying the only way Jeff Jarrett's continuing to stay relevant in wrestling is by attaching his name to the best tag team in the world today. And if he thinks that FTR are going to get outsmarted and outworked by two former TNA rejects, he's got another thing coming. And as far as that horse-faced bitch of a wife goes, hopefully Jeff's got an insurance policy for job security because he's going to need it once FTR get through with him. I do like how after all these years, the horseface comments about Karen are still over. So at that point, here comes Mark Briscoe, and obviously he's still a little uptight about the cough cough incident that occurred with him and FTR a few weeks back. That is the infamous pile driver angle of doom that was so abhorrently done, it almost made me vomit at the sight of it. But Cash is there to tell Mark that Jeff and Jay are playing him for a fool, and he needs to remember the wars that the Briscoes and FTR went through last year. That's the kind of respect that they still have for one another. And this is where things get a little spicy. Dax tells Mark that the pile driver thing was a mistake, and he wants Mark to shake his hand and let bygones be bygones. And long story short, Mark ends up popping Dax in the face with a hard slap. Lit him up like the 4th of July, it was so loud. It's a hell of a right hand. I mean, main audio feed caught that perfectly. But when Mark went to leave, this is kind of where the segment turned around a little bit for me. Because here come the heels down the aisleway. And leading the charge, of course, is Jeff and Karen, the centers of attention, just like their overinflated egos tell them they ought to be. And Mark, doing the right thing, shoves Karen to the side, stepped on her hooves while doing so, and then, perfect timing, right as Jeff goes to give Mark a big ol' hug, Mark smacks the shit out of that fucking jabroni, lays him out like a dweeb. And it's so great because the camera was on Karen and Jeff for no more than 3 seconds. And that was it. They both got punked out. Mark looked like such a badass in doing so. You know, and of course he goes up to Jay Lethal and told him he loves him, but he's getting fed up with all this BS. And like, admittedly so, I will credit them for attempting to course correct a little bit with some of this. The angle from a couple weeks back was just downright awful, and it left me really sour on the entire program because I did not like the direction they were taking all of it. I'm still not entirely convinced that they're not going to try and swerve us by trying to turn Mark Briscoe heel at the pay-per-view. You know, having him side with Lethal and Jarrett to cost FTR the belts. Of course, that would be the absolute wrong thing to do with Mark. After seeing what they did here, I'm still kind of worried they might still try and turn Mark. But it looks more like a 50-50 shot instead of an 80-20 chance. I mean, they were really going hard in that direction at one point where if the Mark turn didn't happen, it would have kind of come off like a swerve. So they sort of left the door open to interpretation a little bit. I'm still kind of on the fence about it, but like I said, if they turn Mark on FTR and have him join up with Jarrett, Lethal, and the rest of the Carney collection with the slapstick goofball and the lumbering giant and the walking she-horse, then these people can go fuck right off. But if Mark does the right thing and he calls the match down the middle and he winds up raising FTR's hand by the end of it, then good. I'll accept that. Kind of spoiled any attempt at a preview for that one, but at least you got my prediction. And meanwhile, I learned a thing or two about Sammy Guevara here. Apparently he rejected promotions at work when he was younger because his bosses told him to grow up and be an adult. And he told them to all go piss up a rope. You know, it's starting to make a little bit of sense now. Sammy acting like a pretentious, entitled prick. Being a horrible employee that's impossible to get along with. Maintaining bad habits and refusing to learn how to improve as a wrestler and a human being. I think we've come full circle now. At least we now know why Sammy refuses to act like an adult. It's because he'd rather defy authority like all those typical Gen Zers out there who think they've got the world figured out. He'd fit right in there with all the blue-haired radical feminists that preach about how horrible men are, or the activists that are burning down the big cities and complaining about white privilege every week. Now I get it. After all these years, I finally get why I fucking hate everybody and can't stand being around regular, ordinary citizens. It's because they all think and act like Sammy fucking Guevara. What a shame. So after that, the House of Drek had another one of their spoopy haunted house matches with all the weird lighting and goofy effects going on. At least that abomination only went about 5 minutes as opposed to 20. But I mostly just fast forwarded through all that. Nothing I need to harp on. The House of Black still sucks. But here's a guy who doesn't suck. MJF. He was up next, top of the hour, to do a promo here in Virgin Vegas to admonish the fans and immediately get under everybody's skin. And of course, the selling point for him this Sunday is the four-way match for the Triple B. So he's out there talking about his challengers and trying to get some heat for running their names through the mud. The best was easily Jungle Boy, where he said that he should be forced to sit through an echo chamber and cut promos until he bores himself to death. God, ain't that the fucking truth? God, is that kid blander than a jar of spoiled mayonnaise. But at the same time, he's also explaining that the four of them started with zero television exposure prior to AEW's launch, and within 4 years, they've managed to beat some of the top names that have come through the system. And while MJF is saying that all four of them represent the foundation of AEW, he also says that he's grown bored of the brand. He says the competition sucks, and he's just sort of treading water as a big fish in a small pond right now. Says his contract is still coming due in 2024, and while the fans hate when he mentions it, it's still the albatross that he's holding over Tony Khan's neck, because as long as he's the world champion, the ball is in his court, and he could end up leaving with the belt if he manages to hold it past his contract expiration. And right around that point was where Darby Allin interrupted, strategically coming out wearing high-heel platform boots. Made him tower over Max by like 2 or 3 inches. Thought to myself right then and there, take note, AEW locker room. I think more talent in AEW would benefit from wearing platform shoes during their promo segments. And, Darby sort of did the rambling monologue, talked about being poor and cleaning toilets and living in his car and something about how AEW made him sane. I nearly burst out into tears laughing so hard. AEW made somebody sane. That's a new one. Almost too laughable to be true. So, Darby threw a couple more word salad thoughts in there until MJF just cock-blocked him like a punk. And then Sammy Guevara ran down to send MJF packing when he loaded up the diamond ring to try and hit Darby with it. And after Max powdered on the rampway, Jungle Jackass met him about halfway so he could clothesline him and hold up the belt. Oh my God. Jungle Jack looking like the fucking store manager at Walmart with that dress shirt and jeans on. Just a total generic looking bum. And that was more or less their go-home angle for the world title match on Sunday. A good promo from MJF, followed by a not-so-good promo from Darby, followed by the rest of the challengers coming out and staring down everybody else in a really anticlimactic fashion. Woo! Salivating to see that match. What's a thing MJF always calls mediocre? Mid? Yeah, I'd say that about sums this one up. It was very mid. As was the match that followed. It's Taya Valkyrie versus some indie girl named Lady Frost. while I didn't really pay all that close attention to the match, I was more so fixated on wondering, how exactly did Taya and Jade Cargill for the TBS title become a thing at the pay-per-view? I can't even remember the last thing Taya did on television to even warrant a title match with Jade, much less it being happening on pay-per-view. I also don't really get the whole Jade Cargill thing in AEW and why people still think she's a big deal. I mean, we see her like once every 4 or 5 weeks where she shows up and beats some random chick on TV. Her matches are usually lousy and her segments are always forgettable. But she's still undefeated. And that's Tony Khan's game plan, apparently. Keeping her undefeated until the end of time. Until she beats Goldberg's artificial 176-0 WCW streak. That actually would be a great rib if AEW was looking to actually generate some money off of Jade. Just keep artificially inflating the number like they did with Bill back in the late 90s. And then by the time they royally fuck it up to the point where nobody could possibly care, they can start having some of the other girls come out every week and claim they're 177-0. Then they can do the Sid Vicious storyline where every time he wrestles, the number jumps all over the place because nobody can keep track of what number he was at the previous week. I just created the most compelling storyline that AEW's ever done for their female division. Literally 9 seconds. That's all it took me. Run with it, Tony. Go there. It's genius. But yeah, all seriousness, who gives a fuck about this match at the pay-per-view? Does anybody really care? If so, I need to know how and why. Because your tolerance for being spoon-fed dog shit is much higher than mine. Just keep shoveling that manure down your throat and you people will eat it like chocolate cake. Numbnuts. So following that came the real talking point of the program this week. Literally having nothing to do with the Double or Nothing pay-per-view, because we've already pretty much accepted the fact that that show's a complete afterthought already. Instead, Tony Khan was back on TV yet again for another update. This time regarding AEW Collision. Now, I already noted last week how I thought it was very odd that they announced dates for tapings of the Collision program after the pilot episode, but they didn't actually bother announcing a time and a date for the pilot show. Well, they announced the time. They didn't announce a location. Well, it turns out we now know where it's going to be happening. Not that our suspicions were ever much in doubt, but it is taking place at the United Center in Chicago. And of course, as soon as those words crossed Tony's lips, more than half the Las Vegas crowd erupted with CM Punk chants. And admittedly so, that did put a smile on my face momentarily, because it's at least good to know that even the cult AEW audience misses Punk to a degree. Despite Meltzer Magoo and the Elite's best efforts to turn the people against him, still hasn't worked. Because they've seen what the shows are like without him around. And they're not pretty. So, getting Punk back on board is exactly the right call. And you know what? As much crap as I give him from time to time, hats off to Tony for not being persuaded differently. After having the Bucks and Omega in his ear for far too long, telling him to make calls and trying to steer Tony away from the Punk train, it's good to know that Tony's willing to put his foot down and make the right call. Now, granted, the name CM Punk was not outright mentioned here, but I think we can reasonably put 2 and 2 together. I don't know how his return will be done or what the most effective method of doing so will be. Like, does he just show up at the top of the program? Do they try and make it some kind of special occasion? I don't really know, but this is one step closer in getting me to just tap out from this fucking Dynamite garbage altogether. Because after that June 17th show goes, depending on how good or bad the debut episode is for Collision, I'm going to be weighing my options. I'm going to be doing some heavy thinking on whether or not I really want to keep investing my energy in this Dynamite show. You know, if Punk's going to be exclusive to the Saturday program and He's going to avoid any contact with what happens on the Wednesday shows. That's fine by me. I'll take whatever he's involved with on the Saturday shows over whatever garbage you'll be spewing on Dynamite going forward. You can keep your BCC, Elite, House of Drek, and indie-minded slop fest over there. And I'll just casually tune in to watch Punk dish out the good stuff on the Saturday show. Not that I'm trying to get ahead of myself, because, I also haven't broken down the logistics of the Collision roster yet. And I do have a thing or two to say about that down the road. I'm wondering when the best time would be to break that down. But for where we are now, this was at least promising. I still think it's fucking criminal that things have spiraled so much out of control that Tony's needed to resort to this form of programming just to keep the EVPs happy. But nevertheless, here we are. This is what happens when you let the inmates run the fucking asylum. But provided Collision goes well and looks like it'll be worth my investment than the Dynamite shows are, I might just go ahead and start reviewing the Saturday shows exclusively. Remove Dynamite from the equation and let that show rot into obscurity like Rampage has. So at this point, of course, it wouldn't be a go-home show for a pay-per-view if we didn't get the obligatory contract signing skit. And of course, Excalibur making a valid point during Adam Cole's entrance here. The match was already signed prior to the contract signing being booked. So what the fuck was the point of the contract signing period? Well, the answer is they needed to book an angle for Jericho versus Cole. So they did it anyway. So the ring starts to file in with about 25% of the roster. Jericho's Jagoffs are in there. Roddy Strong's hanging out with Cole in the background, which is kind of a good summary of Roddy's entire run with AEW thus far. Hanging out in the background with Adam Cole. Just like he did as his sidekick in NXT for 4 years. And by the way, spoiler alert, I'm going to be covering another contract segment that took place on the Crockett TV show a little bit later on. What I will call the effective way to screen for a legit contract signing in wrestling. By the time it was over, it would have behooved the parties involved here to have maybe watched that segment at some point. Not that I expect any of these idiots to be watching 1987 classic wrestling footage. God forbid! So for this particular contract signing, they verbally agree to no physicality. Not that any of that matters, because we've already seen Cole beat the shit out of Jericho multiple times already, so who cares? But Cole kind of ran down the gauntlet of all the horrible stuff Jericho's done in the last month or so. He's talking about how he hasn't eaten or slept because all he's done is think about what he's been wanting to do to Jericho for weeks now. And I can actually buy that comment on paper when you look at the state of Adam Cole physically and realize he looks like he probably hasn't had a decent meal since he graduated high school. And the promo itself was all right. Cole's talking about how he's going to shatter Jericho's jaw, break his kneecaps, break his hand. It's generic stuff that a fired-up babyface would say if he's pissed off. I just don't really buy the idea that if this were real, Adam Cole would be capable of doing any of those things to Chris Jericho, because looking at him compared to Jericho is like listening to a 9-year-old tell a 35-year-old bodybuilder that he's going to beat him in a bench press contest. Do you see where the issue is? So in short, Jericho signed the contract and replayed the footage of the girls assaulting Britt Baker with a kendo stick a few weeks back. That was when Cole was cuffed to the ring ropes and couldn't help her. Very cartoonish fashion, that was. And, well, just when you think things couldn't get any stupider and more illogical, while Jericho is mocking the fact that Adam Cole signed himself into a corner because the match at the pay-per-view is unsanctioned, therefore, it is 5-on-2 advantage Jericho appreciators, Cole then says that he made a personal phone call to somebody very close to him, somebody that will be in the corner of Cole and Roddy at the pay-per-view. And at that point, I thought to myself, oh shit, that's great. Kyle O'Reilly's going to be back. Wrong. Instead, we got Sabu. Sabu. I believe a mere age of 58. Last I checked on the interwebs. Yeah. So in the world of kayfabe, if you listen to some people pronounce it, still makes me laugh. But in the world of wacky pro wrestling, I'm supposed to buy a relatively smart intellectual man, if I do say so myself. I am supposed to buy that a near 60-year-old retired professional wrestler is supposed to watch Adam Cole's back while 5 grown adult wrestlers in their prime are hanging out at ringside attempting to beat the shit out of Cole alongside Chris Jericho. Now, I have not asked Adam Cole. I do not know what his IQ level is. I do not know how many AP courses he took in high school. But I would venture a guess that he's not a dumb man. He probably had a relatively decent GPA for his time. So, I'm wondering, how exactly did he think that this would favor well for him? How exactly did he look at this on paper and think, oh, we got him now. Jericho's fucked. We got Sabu. Even though the numbers advantage is still 5-on-3 for the heels, and Adam Cole's additional help is a 60-year-old former ECW guy whose best days were back when he was wrestling in 1997. Oh, but Cole's got it under control. No, he's thought this game plan out. What the fuck? The guy that could barely wrestle worth a lick when TNA was rehashing the gimmick in the mid-2010s. And here I sit in 2023, and I'm supposed to think that the JAS would sweat fucking Sabu? And it's ridiculous because all the heels have to sit there and sell it. They have to be intimidated. They have to pretend like they might have to switch game plans because now Sabu's been added to the mix. That throws everything for a loop. There's no way that the JAS have this under control now. Sabu is going to be the deciding factor in all this. Oh, is he now? What's he going to do? Botch another fucking moonsault attempt off a chair? Like he's done for the entirety of his career because the guy was always a rotten wrestler? And by the way, if anybody out there was a fan of Sabu, I don't give a shit. I always thought the guy sucked. But just removing all my personal biases for a second here, what was the point of this? I'm trying to be authentic when I ask that question. I really want to know, what was this designed to do? To get a pop? Because that's the only reason I could think that Tony would book it. He knew it would get a reaction in Las Vegas because people are idiots. And they always get swept up in the emotion instead of seeing things for what they are. Another stupid idea that makes no goddamn sense. Oh, and by the way, just to let you know, leave it to AEW to book a contract segment on television for a match that is not even an officially sanctioned AEW match. Their words, not mine. It's not even a match, period. That's a level of Tony Khan genius that makes calculus look like third grade level math. My God. This show makes me lose brain cells. Oh, but we're not done with the Jericho Appreciators. Because now that we've gotten to see Roddy Strong wrestle an 8-man tag on TV, where he did not even score the pin for his team, followed by a god-awful, nonsensical street fight false count anywhere match with Chris Jericho, now is the point. 3 weeks into Roddy's run with AEW, 3 matches in. Now Tony decides to book him in a straight match with somebody. Now, of course, his opponent is Danny Garcia, because that figures. But isn't it amazing how it would wind up being Roddy's best showing out of the 3 matches he's had? Interesting how that works. When you structure a match based on a guy's strength as a worker instead of booking him in matches that don't play to his strengths. Roddy Strong, the pro wrestler, that works. Roddy Strong, the street fighter, Roddy Strong, the brawler, not so much. Now, I'm of the belief that it would have probably been more effective if Roddy just went in there and beat the shit out of the guy in like 3 minutes and stretched him like a rubber band, instead of letting Garcia get heat on him for the majority of the match until Strong had to make a comeback at the end. But everything Roddy did looked great. Dude's a fucking machine in there with everything he does. He hits hard. He works hard. He's always in the right spot for everything. He always takes his stuff seriously. The finish kind of came out of nowhere, and I'm not really sure if I like the idea of Roddy basically no-selling a sharpshooter so he could just fire back like 8 seconds later and beat Garcia with a flipping backbreaker thing. But, again, if I sat here and nitpicked everything about AEW, these would be 24-hour live streams. Again, the match was what it was. I wish Tony would have had a better game plan for Roddy before he signed him to a contract instead of just plunking him out there on television as Adam Cole's sidekick again. I understand he's not going to be everybody's cup of tea, but you can't tell me that this is the best idea you could come up with for the guy. After all those years in NXT under that developmental umbrella, the guy's shown that he can be more than just generic spot monkey number 374. I mean, yeah, point taken, the guy's never been the best promo in the world, and he does sort of have a reputation for people joking about the fact that he looks like a gas station attendant, but at least the guy can fucking wrestle. Can't say that about most of the people working in this company, but he's one of the strong suits. No pun intended there. But with the way Tony's presented him on TV right now, he's just a dude on the roster. Took him 3 matches in to even get the guy over in a meaningful, decisive way. And I'm supposed to think that Tony's going to get or keep the guy relevant for longer than 4 months? With the way that guy books? Doubt it. So at this point in the show, gonna be honest, when I saw that the main event was Claudio and Flatwheel Yuta versus the Lucha Fucks for the Ring of Honor tag titles, dude, I just threw up my hands and said, I'm good. I can miss out watching that match and not wake up the next morning feeling guilty about it. So why don't I go ahead and just proceed with running down the card for this Sunday and briefly analyze what awaits us. Because I don't really want to spend a lengthy amount of time recapping this mediocre attempt at what they put together for a pay-per-view card. I've said it before. It's obvious this show is just sort of being put on the back burner. It's just kind of a pit stop for them. They've already hyped the Collision show in June as being a much bigger deal. They're already talking about the Wembley show and the Forbidden Door show and everything else that's upcoming over the summer. And there really didn't seem to be a whole lot of forethought put into this one. And now that I'm looking over the card and seeing how everything's been structured, man, there's just not a whole lot I'm looking forward to. Including the MJF and the FTR matches, man. And think about how much effort has to go into a card for me not to be excited about an MJF and an FTR match. Low effort. So this entire pay-per-view screams out to me. And I've talked about it before. The four-way match for the AEW World title, or what they're calling the Four Pillars match. This was a dream idea for Tony Khan before he even put the pen to paper. Regardless of whether or not the match should have happened, well, it's happening. I much would have preferred seeing MJF just have a singles match with Darby. I think a lot of people are of that opinion. Jungle Boy and Sammy Guevara just kind of void filler. That's the way I see it. I have not been all that immersed in this program since they started feuding. Gonna be honest, there's really not a whole lot to look forward to for me. I mean, MJF retaining is kind of a foregone conclusion, so we'll see what happens in the fallout. Is this something where maybe Darby doesn't get pinned, so they go ahead and proceed with MJF and Darby as a singles program? Could be. Did they just move MJF on to a set of completely different opponents? Who knows? But I gotta be honest, man. If I'm being point blank about it, this is probably the least excited I've been about an MJF match, or just an MJF program in general, since the Jericho stuff a few years ago. I mean, as good as the guy is, this just really ain't lighting my world on fire. Sorry to say. And the same goes with the AEW tag title match. FTR defending against Jeff Jarrett and Jay Lethal. If this was being booked by a competent promoter that knew what he was doing, you look at the four guys involved, and regardless of my opinion of Double J, I mean, I've had a lot of negative things to say about him in the past, but again, I talk about it all the time in these recaps. The guy's a good wrestler. And when he's buttoned down and he's serious about his work, and he doesn't get too cute with his segments, the guy can deliver some entertaining stuff. It's few and far between, but just looking at the four guys here, Harwood, Wheeler, Jarrett, Lethal, it should be a good match. I don't really doubt for a second that the match won't be good, but the storyline involving it is just dreck. It's been dreck since they started building it on TV. You know, and a lot of that has to do with the Sanjay Dutt and Satnam Singh stuff. Like, they're just such a distraction in all this. But even when you look at FTR as the World Tag Team Champions, it's like, well, I mentioned it earlier when I was recapping the segment here they shot on the Dynamite Go Home show. What have FTR done with the belts since they won them? They beat Austin and Colton on TV, and I mean, they've been the champions, but has their title reign really amounted to anything yet? And what's their level of competition at this point? That's why I'm kind of concerned that they might be doing the heel swerve with Mark Briscoe, because the other thing I forgot to factor into the equation here is that he's still booked as a special guest referee. So how he factors into all this is sort of up in the air. What happens if Mark Briscoe ends up fucking over FTR and Jarrett and Lethal end up winning the belts? I mean, to be honest with you, it's like, okay, and what happens if FTR retain? Do you see why it's kind of like a no-win situation? Because where do Harwood and Wheeler go after this match? Sorry, I keep using their last names. Dax and Cash, it's easier to say it that way. But who do they feud with afterwards? What's the state of AEW's tag division currently? Who else is there? Top tag teams, legit teams that people take seriously. Are there any? I don't think there are. Taven and Bennett, I mean, I have no idea what happened to those guys. I don't think we've ever seen them on Dynamite, period. But apparently they're signed to the company. Unless they're under those exclusive Ring of Honor deals. But that's the only team I can think of that would give FTR suitable competition. And that's not even necessarily a real feud, like a tag title feud, much less just like a TV match that you blow off as a one and done. So, I mean, I could go either way with this, to be honest with you. I wouldn't say I would get really excited about the idea of Lethal and Jarrett winning the belts, but again, when you look at the state of the tag division, it's like, is there really a wrong choice? I don't know. And again, talking about another match on this card that probably should ideally make me excited, but I'm really not. When I've seen the way they botched the Wardlow run and the fact that Christian Cage really hasn't done anything remotely constructive with AEW since he signed, this TNT Championship match with Wardlow and Cage. And when did this become a ladder match? Why? Because Christian hit Wardlow with a ladder on TV one time? All of a sudden that gives him incentive to make this a ladder match? Oh my God. Just screaming for a nightmare scenario to happen, man. Does this play to either guy's strengths as a wrestler at this point? Why would Wardlow be in a ladder match? At his age, why would Christian be in a ladder match? I don't get it, man. I don't get it. I mean, I haven't already really been that excited about Wardlow as the TNT champion. Just a far fall from grace with that guy over the last 12 months. At this point last year, I was super high on Wardlow. I really thought that guy was going to be one of the building blocks for AEW's future. And here we are 12 months later, and this is what we're left with. Don't really have much to say about it. I mean, Wardlow retaining seems like the right call, but again, kind of like what I talk about with the FTR match, is it really the right call? Does it matter who goes over here? Honestly, at this point, I think I'd rather see Christian as the TNT champion because at least I know we'll get some consistent good promos with him. With Wardlow, it just seems like a lost cause. But we'll see what they do. The 21-man Battle Royal International Championship Blackjack thing, whatever they're calling it, I don't give a shit about that. I'll probably just skip watching that at the pay-per-view. Jamie Hayter and Toni Storm for the women's title, I'm also ambivalent about. I don't plan on watching that match. The Anarchy in the Arena match. I mean, there is a part of me that kind of feels enticed to watch it just to see the sheer train wreck unfold. I mean, they booked this thing last year and it did not end well. There were a lot of guys that got injured. The match was a complete disaster. I mean, you look at the guys involved here. It could be train wreck level horrible. Could be like that exploding barbed wire death match is just so ungodly awful you can't take your eyes off it. A lot of stupid shit could happen here. Man. I might have to roll the dice on that one. I mean, factoring it this way, too, when I look at the rest of the card, you know, the TBS title match with Jade Cargill and Taya Valkyrie that I'll probably skip out on. This random fucking six-man tag with Ethan Page and the Guns against the Hardy Boys and Hook. Like, again, where in the hell did that match come from? I already forgot that Jeff Hardy returned to television. Y'all remember that? Like 3 weeks ago where Jeff Hardy made his return after being off of TV for like 9 months? Just randomly showing back up in the middle of the show and completely forgetting about it the week afterwards because they did nothing to follow up on it. So he's back, and this is what they got him doing. A random 6-person match that I don't think they've spent any time building up on TV at all. Guaranteed most of this stuff has been happening on Rampage, and again, it's fucking Rampage. Who's watching that show? Aside from the diehards. So, I can't even guarantee that I'm going to watch that match. So again, going back to the Anarchy in the Arena thing, I might actually have to sit through that one just to give myself a rationale for even ordering this freaking pay-per-view. We'll see, though. And then, of course, the last match here is Adam Cole and Jericho in the unsanctioned match with Sabu serving as a special guest enforcer. Like, again, why? Whatever. That's all I can say about it at this point. It's just whatever. Adam Cole versus Chris Jericho. I should be excited to see that match. I should. But I'm just not. They botched Adam Cole's return horribly. Jericho once again linking himself to a guy that was super over when he came back. It's just more in the wheelhouse of what Jericho's known for in AEW. Taking the hot angles and turning them colder than a witch's tit. He's the epitome of a vacuum. He just sucks the energy and the life out of anything you could possibly get emotionally invested in. It's a great reputation for the guy to have. But I don't know, man. I mean, looking at that match result, Adam Cole seems likely to go over because I still think the end goal is to eventually program him with MJF for the world title at some point. That's sort of like the overall consensus of what I've developed with Adam Cole. I look at him on TV now and I'm just like, I want to like the guy and I want to be behind him and I want to see the guy succeed, but, given his physical state now and the fact that he's getting sucked up into all this Jericho nonsense, I'm growing distant from him again. When he came back and did that return promo, whenever it was, like late January, early February this year, I was super amped. I was super pumped to see the guy back. And now that I've seen him back and seen that he really hasn't done much to improve his physical stature and the fact that I just don't really take anything he does seriously, and again, the vortex of suck that is Jericho just coming in and ruining all of Cole's momentum, I'm just not excited about this match. And again, the go-home angle they shot really didn't do anything to boost my enthusiasm. I mean, I'll watch it. I don't expect much out of it. I mean, the problem, too, is you look at this on paper, and the first thing you see when you see Unsanctioned is you immediately resort to thinking it's going to be a garbage street fight. And that's probably what it'll wind up being. They'll hit each other with plunder. They'll fight all over the arena. It'll be an extension of the Anarchy in the Arena match, just with 2 guys instead of 10. But that's all I got on that, man. I don't really know what else to say. I mean, am I just sort of out to lunch here, or is this like one of the most underwhelming cards AEW's ever put together for a pay-per-view? I mean, you look at the talent pool on here. You got MJF. You got FTR. You got Wardlow. You got Adam Cole and Chris Jericho. There is some name power there. But the enthusiasm level is just not there. And I'm not the only one saying that, man. I've read the reports. I do a little bit of research on the internet in my spare time. There doesn't seem to be a whole lot of overall buzz for this thing. I think people are just kind of accepting it as a pay-per-view that's going to happen, but the bigger focus seems to be on stuff that's happening later this summer. Again, the Collision show in June, whatever's going to be happening at that Forbidden Door thing. Obviously the Wembley show is on people's mind right now. I don't know. It's just Double or Nothing just kind of seems like an afterthought. And if people are willing to accept that as such, that's fine. Just don't go out of your way to overpraise the show after it's over when you know it's mediocre at best. Just warn people about that in advance. So, all right, there you have it. I gave you a little card preview. It wasn't my most in-depth analysis, but again, I'm just giving you what I got. A mediocre build to a mediocre show warrants a mediocre preview prediction, but at least you got one. So, with that said, how about we move on to the Crockett review and the World Class review, because I'm looking forward to talking about those shows more right now. All right, so we're in for another short ride this week. And whereas last week's program was sort of focused around one major feud, this was sort of a scatterbrained episode of sorts. Not to say that was a bad thing. We just had more of a condensed version of a 2-hour show that we would normally get with the Crockett TV episodes, trying to filter in as much content as they can in that time frame. And after showing us a replay of the title match on last week's show where the Midnights won the U.S. tag titles, what I think amounted to the 11th replay within the span of 1 week on that one match alone, we then jumped to the studio for David and Tony to run down the gauntlet for the program. Again, still only 60 minutes, but things definitely went by more quickly. As you'd expect too, the squash matches were reduced. We will talk about the big story for the show, mostly centering around the development of what's been going on with Tully and Dusty surrounding the TV title. Before we get there, well, apparently someone said, fuck it, we're phoning it in for this one, send Robert Gibson out there to do a promo. And I love Robert Gibson, I love the Rock and Roll Express, but if you've been paying attention to these Crockett reviews since we started doing them in late 85, the one thing you have always heard me say is that when they put a microphone in front of Robert Gibson, one of two things are bound to happen. You're either going to catch about 50% of the mumbling dialogue, or you're going to catch 0%. I don't think there's ever been one single solitary Robert Gibson promo I have ever heard where after it was over, I said, damn, that was a fabulous promo by Robert Gibson. Most of the time, my reporting boils down to, what the fuck did that marble mouth just spew? So you'll be shocked when I say this. Robert Gibson did a promo and I have no clue what the fuck he said. I heard something about Ricky Morton not being there for reasons. And he and Ricky are still after Rude and Bull and the World Tag Team Championships. The promo went approximately 20 seconds and it was over. And I said, thank God it was mercifully short. So after that total waste of 60 seconds, we cut back to the ring for one of the big takeaways on this particular episode. Last week, they hyped the return of the fabulous Freebirds to Atlanta for the studio tapings. And here they were in the flesh. Hayes, Gordy, and Roberts all set to wrestle a squash against Randy Barber, Alan Martin, and Lee Peak. Just the epitome of send out the 3 worst job guys we have on the studio show right now so the Freebirds can just steamroll and beat the shit out of them. And because WWE actually owns the rights to the Bad Street USA music, we do not get any dubbed over theme music here. Got the original tune. We also got Buddy Roberts back with a full head of hair. Now granted, it had been about 4 years since the shaving angle they did with him in Dallas, so it was expected his hair would have probably grown back in full by that point. Of course, we all thought the same thing about Kurt Angle when they shaved his head, and yeah, it didn't end so well for him. Now, obviously, you would expect since they were in Atlanta, the Freebirds were going to be baby faces, and that was pretty much the case. The match itself only went like 2 minutes before Hayes and Buddy hoisted up one of the job guys so Gordy could hit him with a middle rope front power slam for the pin. The real bulk of the conversation was with what happened after in the promo. Of course, Gordy was completely blown up for this. He was probably in the ring for a subtotal of 1 minute in that 2-minute match, and he could barely get through this thing without wheezing. I did laugh that he referred to Tony Schiavone as Guy. Boy, is that ever Southern slang. And Gordy's contributions here were saying that the Freebirds have been blackballed by almost every wrestling promoter they've ever encountered, and they may not be the best, but they know that they can swing a chair when necessary. And Buddy didn't really have too much to note here, but Hayes also drew our attention to the Four Horsemen, since that was the big match they were promoting for the 7th of June in the Omni. And Hayes told Luger, Tully, and Flair to walk that aisle of Bad Street because many have tried and none have made it to the end of the block. Also funny here, David Crockett chiming in and having to remind Hayes that the Freebirds will also be in Fort Myers. I believe that same night. Guess that slipped Hayes' mind. And, well, obviously, if you know the history with the original three-man Freebirds crew, their first run in Crockett did not last all that long. By the end of Starrcade 87 this year, they were basically gone until they resurfaced in 89 with Jimmy Garvin jumping aboard the team and Buddy Roberts leaving the group. If we ever get that far in the reviews on this channel, I will share my opinion on what I thought was a very hit and miss WCW version of the Freebirds. As was a lot of stuff during the Jim Herd era of WCW in the early 90s. Most of it was a miss. But, seeing the original crew here for that brief stint in 87, it was cool while it lasted. And it was a big deal, too. Their Starrcade 87 match was a huge wet fart by the end of it, but again, we'll address that more as we get closer to the end of the year. For now, we should enjoy the nostalgia while we still can. So after the break, then came time for the segment that I've been most looking forward to talking about. I alluded to this a little bit in my Dynamite report earlier on. We had David and Tony show us the footage of the contract signing that occurred at Crockett's headquarters with the Horsemen, Dusty, and Magnum TA. They were negotiating contracts about the Tully Dusty Challenge, where both guys were putting up $50,000 of their own money in addition to the World's TV title being on the line. And this segment was great for a wide range of reasons, but, I'll sort of break down the particulars to give you an idea of how they established this match to happen. So the Horsemen are hanging out and bitching that Dusty and Magnum are fashionably late. And that was awesome in and of itself. Calling them unprofessional for not being on time for such an important meeting. So eventually, here come Magnum and Dusty storming through the door. Dusty's got the fucking bag of money in his hand. And immediately, JJ is calling bluff on the fact that Dusty doesn't actually have $50,000 in the bag. So Dusty, without uttering a word, glaring a hole through JJ the entire time, he begins dumping out the stacks of cash on the table. And JJ, in realizing midway through his sentence that he just got shut down, of course he's still trying to pretend like it's all fake money. I thought he was going to go full-fledged My Cousin Vinny and say, yeah, but how do I know those aren't just a bunch of ones with 20s wrapped around them? But I don't think that movie came out for another 4 or 5 years after this. Crockett was ahead of the time. In any case, JJ tells Jim Crockett that Tully dictates the terms of the contract, therefore he will not wrestle Dusty on TV unless he gets... I forget exactly what he called it here. I think JJ said it was an appearance fee or a guaranteed appearance fee. So, of course, Crockett whips out his checkbook. And meanwhile, JJ, out of the courtesy of his own heart, tells Jim that he can pick the time and the date for when this match takes place. And like the sly dog Crockett is, he then proceeds to open up his briefcase to reveal an already formed contract for a TV title match scheduled for June 6th in Greensboro. And while the heels are reading over the terms of the contract, JJ stumbles across the part that reads, 60-minute time limit. And of course, the whole gimmick with Tully's TV title defenses is that all of his matches have been scheduled to take place in 25 minutes or less, so they were not too happy about those stipulations being added. But, since the contract was already made beforehand, they could not negotiate their way out of that one. So they agreed to the 60-minute time limit. Because of course Tully knows he can beat Dusty under that time. No issue at all. And when JJ goes to try and grab the money, Dusty smacks his hand and tells him that the money is going to be with Magnum TA at ringside in Greensboro, but the match is signed and sealed. And, again, let me say this before I move on, because it really hit me watching this thing unfold on TV. Now, I had already watched this segment before I saw the Dynamite show, so I had a little bit of context here. I already kind of talked about why the AEW contract signing just sucked. But, just to try and draw it back full circle here, we also talk a lot about the overexposure of the contract signings in wrestling. Even with WWE, like, they do 50 of these things every month, and they all suck a cock because they're so paint by numbers with everything that happens. Contracts already in the ring, both wrestlers come out, they cut scripted promos back and forth, they sign the contracts, and they brawl. Same shit, different week, basically. This was an actual contract signing scenario where it actually came off like a genuine negotiation of deals from both parties. Nobody screamed at each other. Both parties stated their case. Jim Crockett, the smart promoter, already played his hand before the actual sit-down, so he knew the Horsemen were going to try and pull a fast one on him, but he outsmarted them. And the best part, by the end of it, nobody got in a fucking brawl. Or God forbid, nobody broke a table. Good God, it looked like grown men actually conducting business. God forbid we ever see that in wrestling again, where people are acting like adults instead of delinquent teenagers. So I enjoyed this. It's one of those VTRs where if I'm ever hired to come into Agent A creative meeting in WWE and talk with these scriptwriters about putting a show together, this is something I'd be showing everybody before they even suggested another in-ring contract signing again. I would say, okay, but watch this shit. And do more stuff like this. And of course, they would crinkle up the idea and throw it in the trash and just book the same garbage they always do. And then I would quit the job and tell everybody to go fuck themselves sideways. I think Jim Cornette's rubbed off on me a little too well. Then immediately following that, we had Lex Luger beating Larry Stevens in a brief little squash. One with the rack in about a minute. Literally nothing else to say about it. That then took us to a Ric Flair style and profile promo. This was the prototypical, let me just spit out like 47 different talking points in about 2 minutes because I know we're pressed for time this week. I think I got all this, but here was the extent of his message. Space Mountain, girls ride it, they love it, blah, blah. Something about how they were going to retire the Road Warriors. He called out the Freebirds by referring to them as the Fruit Birds. No comment. And then he called out Precious by saying that Jimmy Garvin currently has Flair's girl, including the coat that she stole from him under his nose. And it was at that point, after realizing that Flair is still stalking Garvin's wife in kayfabe, wouldn't Garvin have thought to file some kind of restraining order or lawsuit against Flair for this creepy behavior? Or are we led to believe that Precious is secretly okay with all this? Because if I was her husband, I'd be taking one look at that and say, maybe we just play it safe and make sure this guy can't get within 100 yards of you. Especially when Flair is saying that Precious will be coming around the mountain eventually. I see the pun, but it doesn't make it any less unsettling. Meanwhile, Tony Schiavone doesn't seem to be all that concerned. He immediately pitches it back to the ring for more wrestling on this pro wrestling show. Never mind the creepy old dude stalking another guy's wife on broadcast cable television. Nothing you wouldn't see out of a Lifetime movie anyway. And of course, the match he pitches to is the Raging Bull versus Rick Nelson. The hell is with all the missing tag partners this week? Rick Rude was not on the show. Ricky Morton was not on the show. Did all the tag teams just decide to take a sabbatical this week? No, much like the Luger match, this also went about a minute and Bull won with a flying burrito. And the fans all nonchalantly chanted, "Ragin' Cow, Ragin' Cow." That was about as much energy and life as I put into it. Kind of like that bird out there that was just squawking a minute ago. I don't know if you heard that. But yeah, same demeanor. It's like they had a giant teleprompter on screen that read, "Chant this." And the studio fans all just went, "Fuck, okay. Ragin' cow, ragin' cow." Sucked. At which point we came back for another odd TV segment. So JJ Dillon and Tully are at the booth, and before JJ starts running down the main talking point, at one point he mentioned that Tully Blanchard Enterprises is so successful, they've now rivaled Exxon and General Motors. And I just thought, of all the big companies to mention, he chose Exxon and GM. That's hilarious. Oh, and by the way, fuck Exxon. Just wanted to throw that out there. So this segment was interesting for one particular reason. Something that I had totally forgotten about until the moment JJ mentioned her name here. This is how little impact she had in the business for the short time she was around as a valet. Does the name Dark Journey ring a bell to anybody? Well, in the case you forgot or never even heard of her, it's probably not out of the ordinary. When I bring up names like Sunshine and Precious as valet names that kind of stick more throughout the history of the business because they actually lasted for a while before they left the business, Dark Journey, I think, was around for maybe a year, if that. And then she just kind of phased out. And I don't know the logistics of the story, but I remember she was the girlfriend or the hookup friends with benefit with Dick Slater when he was in Mid-South. I think she did some suspect work on the side in her free time. We'll just call it freelance work. In any case, Slater brought her into the business. I can't remember a whole lot of what she did in Mid-South with him, but I remember when she showed up here on TV managing Tully, that was something that lasted like a couple of months before she left and was never seen again. Now, the story here is that JJ hired her as Tully's assistant because he needed somebody to sort of watch his back and handle all the paperwork dealings. So Dark Journey was brought in here for a cup of coffee, and I can't really remember why she only lasted a couple of months, but again, she was there, and poof, gone before you know it. And her role was to basically stand there and look pretty. She looked more glassy-eyed than anything else. I mean, she was already kind of mid-looking to begin with. Yeah, I don't know. This was very weird. But the segment didn't conclude with that, because we also heard at the top of the program that there was an incident involving Dusty, in addition to the contract signing we saw earlier on. So while Tully is cutting a seething promo, Tony basically cuts him off so they can roll the footage of what happened. And I believe this took place on an NWA Pro taping. The match is Flair and Luger versus the Superpowers. Bob Caudle is obviously calling the action over the headset with Johnny Weaver. And they're in the middle of the heat portion with Nikita when Dusty gets in there and starts fighting back on the heels. They try to do an angle where Luger clips Dusty's knee from behind so Flair can work him over, but Dusty quickly turns the tables to get the advantage back with putting Flair in the figure four. Naturally, that was the turning point, because while Nikita's trying to fend off Luger in the other corner, here comes Tully in the back door to clock Dusty with the briefcase for the DQ finish. And he's immediately going after Dusty's knee with the briefcase while the rest of the Horsemen are trying to pin him down. At some point, Arn also got involved here, and the only reason I noticed it was because he was wearing bright yellow ring trunks. First thing I said, have mercy, Arn. Never again. Please. They're like two colors of ring gear that guys should never wear. White and yellow. Think about it. But of course, Tully ends up giving Dusty the knee drop from the second turnbuckle. The heels are literally kicking Dusty's leg out of his leg until some of the locker room babyfaces run down to send the heels powdering. And of course, the story that Caudle and Weaver are talking throughout this whole deal is that this is the same leg that the Horsemen targeted over a year ago in the cage. So it kind of came full circle here with the exact same incident. The only difference is Ole wasn't around. Interesting timing, though. Right before Tully is scheduled for this TV title defense against Dusty for $100,000. Almost like this was pre-planned. Almost like the heels were maliciously trying to target Dusty on purpose. The dastardly pricks. Well, hopefully we get more follow-up on that in due time. Until then, we get Jimmy Garvin and Precious out for kind of a generic babyface promo. Garvin's putting over the fact that Flair doesn't have this squeeze, obviously mocking him for it. Saying when he goes after Flair, he's also going after all the Horsemen. And beyond that, it was mostly just an infomercial so he can plug an upcoming bunkhouse match in Columbus, Georgia. Garvin Brothers scheduled to wrestle the Midnight Express. Bring your own plunder. With John Moxley as a special guest referee. No, I'm kidding. You kidding me? Ronnie would have stretched the shit out of Mox before he even stepped through the ring ropes. Not really much to say about that promo beyond that. I still don't like babyface Jimmy Garvin, and I'll probably hold that opinion until they put me in the grave. From there, we cut to the ring for Brad Armstrong and Tim Horner versus Tommy Angel and Cougar Jay. I believe Armstrong and Horner at this point were the UWF Tag Team Champions, having recently just defeated Rick Steiner and Sting for the belts. To which I said, wow. I completely forgot about that. In 1987, they put Tim Horner and Brad Armstrong over Rick Steiner and Sting. My, how the landscape drastically changed in the business a few years later. As for this particular match, Armstrong and Horner worked over the job guys for a few minutes and won with an assisted leg drop combo. Remember when Tim Horner was teaming with Ole on TV? Boy, did that sort of dissipate into the ether. Ole who? Never heard of him. There is something oddly amusing about the random flip-flopping of partners with these guys. Brad was at least consistently teaming with Bullet Bob for a while there, but I think they've about run the gauntlet with the majority of the roster for poor White Lightning. That guy was teaming with just about everybody but the janitor. I don't think Bobby Eaton or Stan Lane wanted to do much with him. They were perfectly content teaming with each other here. Speaking of the Devils, here they were. Cornetless at first. Sweet Stan, straight out of the playbook of AEW, immediately grabbing the microphone from Tony and telling him to go piss up a rope. Also, he could introduce Jim Cornette with the big old fanfare and pomp and circumstance. And here he comes, barreling into the frame with his golden tennis racket, which looked wonderfully geeky. And of course, beautiful Bobby and Sweet Stan are now sporting the U.S. tag titles on TV, having won the belts last week. Corny's running down their credentials and talking about all the teams they had to beat in order to win the titles. And he started going off on the fact that Jim Crockett apparently sent Corny a dozen or so contracts in the mail for multiple cage match showdowns throughout the various towns they'll be visiting, all of which will be taking place against Ron Garvin. And it was at this point that I realized, so in the world of kayfabe, I'm supposed to believe in 1987, Jim Cornette would have had more than one cage match with Ron Garvin in the local towns for spot shows. And he somehow managed to survive all of them in succession so he could just go to the next town to get his ass kicked again? Call me crazy, but I find it hard to believe that if this were real, that Ronnie Garvin would have had a baker's dozen set of cage matches with Jim Cornette. Wouldn't Corny have been dead after round 1? Something's not adding up there. Unless I'm supposed to ignore the fact and pretend like there was a decoy Jim Cornette at several of the spot shows. But I guess suspension of disbelief is always a thing too. But you know what I'm saying, right? The fact that the Ron Garvin Jim Cornette cage match was not a one and done. The fact that they try to replicate that match over a series of towns. Again, different generation of fans back then, but isn't this kind of secretly exposing the business? If you really think about it for a minute. Now, whatever. We'll leave it be. From there, we went to the ring for Jimmy Garvin versus Dexter Westcott. Boring squash. Garvin beat him up in about a minute and won with a brainbuster. Also, Dexter's ring gear. The words. I can't. So instead, I'll just move on and talk about the Road Warriors promo. Obviously, they're fuming at the fact that the Horsemen beat up Dusty earlier on and left him for dead. So they challenge the Horsemen to try and jump the two of them at the numbers advantage and see how it fares for them. More of just a plug for a match that was taking place in Chicago the following night. Hawk said that it is taking place inside a cage, and while the Horsemen are going to scratch and claw to try and escape the cage, the Legion of Doom are going to be in there smearing their mangled faces in the chain link. And I believe Ellering's closing line was, and I quote, "The hole is so deep, you can't get out." Word. Let me write that one down. Speaking of things I wrote down for extra reinforcement, Lex Luger wanting all of us to know that the Horsemen are not the common man because there are no plumbers associated with the Horsemen. So again, John Moxley was off the table. But that, ladies and gentlemen, is what we call vital information for your everyday life. Anyway, he kind of just did a raging promo about him being out of patience, waiting for Nikita Koloff to defend the U.S. heavyweight title against him. This was not as classic as the Luger Roy Rage promo from that Super Brawl indie show years back, but fiery Lex Luger always puts a smile on my face. It's like, I don't want to say it was forced, but so much of 87 Luger is, I'm being told that I need to go out there and show more grit, show more fire on camera, so I'm trying way too hard to be mad. Like, you can see right through it. No offense to the guy, he was great, but you know, people often talk about why Luger gets a bad reputation over the years from a lot of fans, and yeah, I mean, I could argue it, but I also see it from their standpoint as well. So, I get it. He had much to learn. He was very green. Cut him some slack, because at least he got better. Can't say that for a lot of people in the business over the years, but Luger improved. But more on that in another time. Let's go to our TV main event. Tully Blanchard beating Rick Sullivan in a minute-long TV title squash. I barely wrote anything down about it. Aside from the fact that it took me about a minute to realize that Rick Nelson and Rick Sullivan were two completely different names. I already saw a job guy named Rick wrestle earlier, and I was like, why the fuck is this guy back on camera getting a title match for? But then I realized it was a different Rick. And to round things out, we had the classic Slick Rick back out with the rest of the Horsemen, minus Arn. You know, when I watch this promo, I can't really say it was anything beyond Rick being Rick. Cocaine is a powerful drug, let me tell you. He's out there snarling and trying to act like Hawk, being all wacky. I'm sure the LOD were sitting in the back laughing the whole time thinking, what in the fuck is this loon bat up to now? I believe Flair's dialogue consisted of promo material as follows. Hawk! Hawk! Where is he? Road Warriors! Road Warriors! Tomorrow night! Tomorrow night! Woo! Show them again, package! Show them again! Flex! And then Lex Luger would pose, and Rick would go, ah! Not kidding. I don't think Ric Flair got one single line out here that made a lick of sense. Everything, he would just cut himself flat in the middle of a sentence and just scream. Fucking love this man. I could watch Ric Flair promos all day and never get bored. Rick's the kind of guy where you could just walk up to somebody on the street and say, hey, are you a fan of professional wrestling? And if they tell you no, just say, okay, give me 5 minutes of your time. Let me show you this Ric Flair promo. Guaranteed they'll be a wrestling fan after that. They'll be laughing their asses off. Nobody else like him. Now, with that said, kids, lay off the coke. It's not good for you. And I don't mean the drink. But I would say that was a pretty fun episode. Again, on the shorter side, only an hour. But they managed to pack a lot of stuff in there. This week it was mainly a Horseman-heavy program, and yeah, that's all right. You know, Midnight's got the bulk of the screen time last week, so they didn't need to overstay their welcome here. We got the visual of them on camera with the U.S. tag belts, and that was enough. I like the direction they took the Totally Dusty program. Obviously, the focus is still aimed around a lot of the local spot shows right now, but the Bash Tour is closing in. So you can see how they're starting to form some of those programs and how they're shaping up leading into the summer. A lot of good stuff on this one. So as we move on to the World Class program, this is kind of an interesting episode. We were partially dealing with some of the fallout from the Texas Stadium show, but we were also at the same time back at the Sportatorium for another round of tapings. Very interesting little main event too, as we'll talk about shortly. We had Mark Lorenz filling in as the play-by-play for this one, but splitting the difference here, we open with another match from the David Memorial Parade of Champions, another one of the prelim matches they taped for that event. It's the Great Kabuki with manager Gary Hart, taking on Kamala with Skandar Akbar and Friday. And my God, man, first thing I wrote down here, Gary Hart with almost a full head of hair. That was a sight to behold. I actually can't recall a time where I ever remember seeing pictures of Gary Hart with hair on his head. When I saw it here, I nearly shat myself. Now, if you have been following the timeline of our World Class reviews, it's been a hot minute since we've seen either Kabuki or Gary Hart in the Dallas region. You'll remember back at the tail end of '82, Gary actually left the Dallas region pretty abruptly and left to go to Georgia. Kabuki left the territory around that same point too. I think when we last saw Kabuki work a match on TV, it was when he was feuding with Akbar's heel crew. Because remember, he was a babyface right at the tail end of his previous run. But he was still doing all the classic Kabuki spots here, including the signature green mist. Good to know this was still at the point where they were recognizing the mist as a dangerous, lethal toxin. Meanwhile, in 2023, you got Asuka blinding Bianca Belair with the same gimmick, and a week later, she's out there perfectly fine like nothing ever happened. As a match, it was anywhere on the spectrum from boring to abysmal. No offense to the talent involved, but I mean, you weren't going to get much out of Kamala in the ring to begin with. Kabuki was okay, but he was never great in the ring. They did some awkward exchanges with chops and kicks, lots of stalling, lots of slow plodding back and forth blows. The most exciting thing in the whole match was the part at the end where Gary Hart started chasing Friday around and threw him into the ring post. And about 10 seconds later, the managers both hit the ring for the double disqualification. I figured to myself, if only they were smart enough to maybe do this about 5 minutes earlier, would have saved everybody the trouble of having to watch the majority of the match happen to begin with. But it was on the shorter side, and not the most effective way of re-debuting Kabuki to the Dallas territory. His first match back, and it is a complete snooze fest with Kamala. And he wasn't even the highlight of the segment. But at the same time, good to get reacquainted with Gary Hart again. Still not sure about the hair thing, but I don't know. Maybe it'll grow on me. Get it? Grow on me? Because it's hair. And hair grows and... Alright, I'll shut up. How's about we move on to the next match? First match for the Sportatorium show. Newcomer Chief Jules Strongbow versus Kelly Kiniski. For those curious, yes, the kayfabe brother of Chief Jay Strongbow. Never saw a lot of footage with the Strongbow team in the WWF from the early 80s, but the name sounded familiar when I heard the ring announcer mention him here. I never realized he was in World Class for a brief period. And as quickly as they rang the bell for the start of this thing, it was almost blink and you miss it short. They do some spots for a couple minutes, and then Strongbow made a short comeback, gave Kiniski the overhead backdrop, and then quickly submitted him with an Indian deathlock. And it was such a rapid-fire submission that Kiniski tried to pitch a fit with David Manning afterwards to argue the call. And all the while, this was such a total afterthought the minute it was over, Mark Lorenz begins explaining that somebody handed him a note indicating that Kabuki and Kamala had got into an altercation in the locker room earlier. And I just kind of thought to myself, you know, sucks to be Kelly Kiniski. Not only are you jobbing out to a new talent, but your match is such an afterthought by the end of it, the play-by-play announcer is already pitching to the next segment after commercial. I think I'm starting to see why Kelly Kiniski did not last long in this sport. But moving over to the altercation angle, we get Lorenz trying to interview the general after the break, and the extent of what we got out of Akbar was money talks. Basically inferred that the great Kabuki is now working for him, delivered word of mouth. We did not actually get Kabuki's side of the story, or Gary Hart's for that matter, because he was still technically managing Kabuki by this point. But since they were scheduled to wrestle next, the general kind of blew off Lorenz's follow-up questions and brought down the Super Ds, the Missing Link, and Kabuki for the next match. They were all part of one team going up against the Freebirds and Killer Khan. Killer Khan, if you remember, also debuted at the Texas Stadium show. He was involved in the run-in angle at the end of the six-man street fight with the Von Erichs. So essentially what we had here was heel versus heel. And while it wasn't necessarily out of the ordinary to see, it was very obscure in this given scenario because Killer Khan literally just debuted at the Parade of Champions taping. And his first match in the Dallas region is part of an 8-man tag going up against another set of heels. If I didn't know any better, I would have thought Tony Khan was booking this shit. And even so, for a match that really didn't have a definitive team for the crowd to root for, they ended up siding with the Freebirds more than anything. And I guess in the context of what happened in the match, you could argue that the babyfaces were the Freebirds by default. It's kind of funny early on. Things kind of broke down with the Freebirds trying to do the constant in and out tags. And when the Super Ds tagged into Double Team Hayes, Gordy was out on the floor throwing chairs around and acting all crazy. And, meanwhile, they're trying to slow things down in the ring again. So while one of the Super Ds is hovering over Hayes, you can audibly hear Hayes yell, "Grab a hold." And it was immediately to the chin lock. I was like, there we go. Slow this bitch down. Trying to make some logic out of this bad boy. And from there, we had the Devastation Inc. team work over Hayes for the, quote, heat. And finally, Hayes was able to tag in Gordy for a small comeback that lasted all of about 10 seconds until all 8 guys were in the ring brawling. And finally, I think David Manning just threw up his hands and said, fuck it. And he called for the double disqualification. It was kind of momentarily amusing, the visual of seeing David run around like a chicken with his head cut off, trying to gain a sense of control with everybody, and meanwhile everybody's just ignoring him and beating the shit out of each other. And of course all the fans are cheering because they get to see a bunch of dudes wail away on each other. But I don't know, this was more or less kind of plot development and whatever's going on with the Kabuki Kamala saga. They did announce here that something did happen to Kamala. He's injured, he's temporarily wounded, whatever. So I'm sure that plot will eventually reveal itself, that the general had something to do with Kamala going down for the count, and that's how Kabuki ended up coming in as his replacement partner. It's not the most creative story in the world when you look at it on paper, but at least you can kind of see how it would unfold. And meanwhile, yeah, the Freebirds. Sort of just kind of filler material for this week. They were part of the plot development, but they weren't all that substantial. But to be frank with you, a lot of the show was just sort of an appetizer to get to the big main event. Even though it was already advertised as a double main event, the only match that really mattered on this one was the Kerry Von Erich Ric Flair main event. And this time, it's non-title. And it is also at the Sportatorium in Dallas. Obviously, Kerry's the new NWA World Heavyweight Champion. Got the awesome visual of him holding up the belt in that pre-taped interview with Lorenz and talking about how important this moment is for him and his brothers. And now it's time to travel the world as the top of the mountain. Or at the top of the mountain, I should say. And his first step in that journey is wrestling the Nature Boy on his home turf yet again. And I don't have to sit here and tell you how Flair's always capable of getting the most out of doing very little. Just going in there and working his ring magic with Kerry. And obviously Kerry's holding up his end of the bargain. Very basic stuff with Kerry getting in the early shine. Of course, Flair's able to cut him off and isolate him for a while. Great stuff as the match rolls along. You got Flair using every desperate ploy to beg off and break away from Kerry, but Kerry stays on him. I like the spot where Flair tried to wrap Kerry in the figure 4, but he ended up getting a surprise claw hold put on him. That was a clever little spot. I also like the press slam spots off the ropes. That's straight out of the Flair Sting or the Flair Luger playbook. There weren't too many guys that could pull shit like that off, but when you had relatively big, strong guys that could pick Flair up into those press slam positions, you do the spots when you could. Kerry pulled it off seamlessly. Had some good false finishes at the end there, with Kerry getting some near falls on Rick. Of course, it takes Bronco like 9 months to kneel down in position to count the falls because he's like 500 years old. And that built up the drama nicely when Flair cut off Kerry at the knee and started working that over so he could pick up the intensity level at the end. He got him wrapped in the figure 4 while the fans are all on their feet cheering Kerry on. And after a few more reversals, Kerry caught Flair off guard, countering a hip toss attempt, and managed to stack him up for a great flash pin. Crowd blew a gasket for that one, as they did for the post-match scuffle, where Flair tried to get into the shoving match with Kerry, and that quickly blew up in his face. This was classic out of his mind Ric Flair, where he's all bug-eyed and pissed off. He got outsmarted by the babyface and got beat. I believe at one point he audibly screamed, "Damn it," to the top of his lungs. And, it definitely worked. It's one of those moments where You could tell they were really trying to solidify Kerry as the top guy in the industry. Getting 2 straight back-to-back pinfalls over Ric Flair, that's not something you saw every day, even during this period in the business. We talk so often about how the title reign was short-lived for Kerry, but this was another iconic moment for his career shortly after winning the strap at Texas Stadium. Figuring they had Flair around after the Stadium show tapings, they were going to try to get the most mileage they could out of the guy. Props to Flair for being willing to go out there and do 2 clean back-to-back jobs for Kerry like that. I know Flair had a reputation for being a little too unselfish with guys back in the day, but this was a passing of the torch in more ways than one. This was Flair saying, "You're the man. You're on top of your game right now, and I'm going to make sure everybody knows it." So good on him. While the main event was sort of the only takeaway from the whole show, there was also some good advancement in other key areas with the storylines. The roster rotation is starting to make some headway by this point in 84. You're seeing that play out with Akbar's team right now. You got Killer Khan introduces the Freebirds Muscle. Obviously, Kabuki and Gary Hart are back in the fold for a little bit. It's interesting because while the shows don't really get any better in terms of the content going forward, seeing Kerry as the NWA World Champion for that period, seeing World Class get a fresh coat of paint with the fans being genuinely excited about Kerry being the top guy in the sport, you look at it as almost a rebirth of sorts for World Class. Even if it's only temporary, but there's like a whole new life being breathed into the product right now. The grieving period for David has sort of run its course. The fans are coming alive again. And it really is like rewatching 82 to 83 shows all over again. The fans are lively, they're into everything. It looks like the Dallas territory is on the up and up right now. Now again, you look at history and it doesn't really pan out that way, but for where we are right now in the timeline, World Class is doing supremely well. Now we just sort of transition into 85 at the end of the year, and that's where things take a turn for the worse. But we'll get there. We will get there. In any case, I think we are about ready to wrap this one up. Actually, I have to head off to work in a little bit because I chose to work on a Friday, which is usually my only day off. And it's not even my day off. It's just the day where I have a low-key schedule in comparison to most. But taking a look at a couple things for this weekend. So I know we have the Saudi show coming up on Saturday for WWE. And then we also have the Double or Nothing pay-per-view for AEW. So just to kind of give you a heads up for the Monday show, I think I'm going to omit the SmackDown report. And I think that'll be it. We'll keep the Retro Raw show there. And we'll save the Monday show for the 2 big pay-per-view recaps. Because I don't really think I want to spend another 2.5, 3 hours trying to wrap up all this content into one video. So we'll take the SmackDown show out and we'll just cover the 2 big pay-per-view events and Retro Raw. Hopefully that will suffice. Anyway, thanks for watching, people. Take care. Peace out.